I'm sure I will before the end of the day. Okay, post-war Labour government, hope and deception. Only weeks after the war in Europe had ended, the Labour Party, eager to fight an election, withdrew from Churchill's wartime coalition, forcing it to resign on the 23rd of May 1945. The general election was called for the 5th of July, and the result, causing widespread amazement, gave the Labour Party victory with 146 seats. This was Labour's first working majority, for while there had been previous Labour governments in 1924 and 29, these had been minority administrations, and their failure had been blamed on their Liberal partners. The Labour Party had not been expected to win the election, but the austerity and misery of total war, which had touched the whole population, had generated a climate of optimism, with a genuine conviction that pre-war poverty and privilege should not be allowed to return. Besides, the Conservatives were associated with the Depression, while others held them responsible for becoming involved in a long war, a sentiment endorsed by Harold Macmillan when he later explained that the Conservative defeat by claiming it was not Churchill who lost the 1945 election, it was the ghost of Neville Chamberlain. Probably more damaging was that the Conservatives showed little public enthusiasm for the Beveridge report, and working people genuinely believed their best interests would be served by placing their future hopes in a Labour government. Now the Labour Party, with Clement Attlee, who Churchill once described as a sheep in sheep's clothing as Prime Minister, proclaimed he would lead the country through the greatest social revolution in its history. When on the 20th of August victorious Labour MPs entered Parliament singing the red flag, many believed that the election of a Labour government represented the dawning of a new and better world that would realise their hopes for a secure and happy future. In the 40 years that preceded the 1945 election, the Labour Party had transformed itself from a trade union parliamentary pressure group to a party of capitalist rule, in which trade union influence had become greatly diluted. From its beginnings, the Labour Party had held the belief that it would simply take too long to build up a conscious socialist majority, to take political action to abolish capitalism and establish socialism. Instead, the immediate task was to build up a strong Labour Party and to elect a Labour government, which would ameliorate the worst excesses of capitalism and through these gradual reforms supposedly convince a sceptical working class of the merits of ultimately achieving a socialist society. Not surprisingly then, the Labour Party fought the election on a platform of reforming capitalism and received a mandate from the electorate to do exactly that. The centrepiece of the Labour election campaign was economic planning, involving the nationalisation of key industries and the introduction of the so-called welfare state. Full employment, or jobs for all, would be underpinned by the economic theory popularised by Keynes that claimed that the economy could be controlled by government through high taxation and high spending to maximise employment and to iron out capitalism's booms and slumps. Throughout the election campaign, the Labour Party opportunistically exploited the post-war appeal of the term socialism that was spuriously portrayed as meaning an increase in government intervention in the workings of capitalism. Herbert Morrison, for example, claimed that the public utility institutions, like the London Transport Boards, were examples of socialisation, while the Labour Party election pamphlet, Let's Face the Future, dishonestly claimed that Labour was a socialist party with an ultimate objective of establishing a socialist Commonwealth of Great Britain. Since the adoption of its 1918 constitution, the Labour Party had propagated the belief that state control or nationalisation was a step towards socialism because it brought about the progressive elimination from the control of industry of the private capitalists. But while repeatedly advocating the elimination of capitalist class control, nowhere did the Labour Party advocate the elimination of capitalist class ownership of the means of production and distribution. Nationalisation means the state, in its role as the committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie, intervenes when the interests of the owning class may be injured, or when the development of new technology is hampered by the lack of private capital. Nationalisation is no more than a different method of running capitalism, taking over control without affecting the property income of the owning class. All governments nationalise when it suits the interests of the owning class. Herbert Morrison indeed noted in 1944 that, and I quote, more socialism, by which he meant a statement on capitalism, was done by the Conservative Party, which opposed it, than by the Labour Party, which had supported it. State monopoly control was acquired on the basis of paying capital its market value, or as the Labour Party itself stated, a fixed rate of interest for the hire or loan of capital. This process guaranteed a fixed return on investment known as fair compensation to the former owners. Accordingly, under the compensation terms for the nationalisation of the Bank of England in October 1946, the stockholders received £400 worth of government stock at 3% to match the 12% dividend that had been paid out over the previous 20 years. After the nationalisation of the Bank of England, the government nationalised and reorganised the air transport industry. A year later, in 1947, the nationalisation of the coal industry created the National Coal Board, bringing 1,500 collieries under state control. The news was greeted with rejoicing and celebration amongst miners, who proclaimed that they would run the industry democratically and in the interests of the community. In 1948, public transport, including road haulage and the docks, was nationalised, closely followed by electricity generation. The gas industry was nationalised in 1949. Plans to nationalise the profitable iron and steel industry, however, proved more controversial. Both the Conservatives and the House of Lords bitterly opposed the plan, prompting the Labour government to pass the Parliamentary Act to control the Lords and to force through the nationalisation, which finally took effect in 1950. Excuse me. But plans to nationalise banks, the chemical industry and insurance companies were quietly dropped. The Labour government had nationalised industry, which apart from iron and steel were unprofitable and in need of investment. Profitable industry remained firmly in the hands of private owners. Another instrument of economic planning came in the form of the Economic Planning Council, set up in 1947 under Edward Plowden and accompanied by a host of new committees. Government control over economic issues intensified when Stafford Cripps replaced Hugh Dalton as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Cripps was quick to leave none in doubt of his intentions, stating, first are exports, second is capital investment in industry, and last are the needs, comforts and amenities of the family. Working people, he insisted, must submerge all thought of personal gain and personal ambition, signalling that the needs of the earning class took priority. His measures aimed to maximise exports at the expense of working people and included a continuation of wartime fair shares rationing, to which was added bread rationing 1946-8 and potato rationing in 1947, the introduction of fuel rationing in the winter of 1946-7 that restricted domestic consumption of electricity, forcing the closure of many factories and throwing 2 million workers temporarily out of work. Import controls that diverted imports to industry, producing for the export market, leaving a chronic shortage of consumer goods. And the introduction of a policy of wage restraint on the unions between 1948 and 50, a time of rising prices. Finally, when recession in America caused exports to collapse, Cripps was compelled to devalue the pound in August 1949, boosting cheaper exports, making imported consumable goods prohibitively expensive. It had always been argued that working conditions would improve under nationalisation and a planned economy. The working class had been persuaded that this would provide worker security, not being laid off in bad times, but because industry would be state-controlled, wages would rise. This view, of course, is contrary to capitalism's general law that wages are the cost of subsistence in each occupation, and ignored the fact that capitalism, being a class system, depends on working class exploitation as the means of extracting surplus value through the wages system. Government cannot serve both owner and worker interests, and taking over the reins of government always means taking over the control for the exploitation of working people and the removal of any obstacle that might endanger profit-taking or the position of the owning class. That working people did not understand the nature of capitalism and class struggle was self-evident. The Labour government had sought power and a mandate to run capitalism, and any thoughts of a brighter future were quickly dashed when wartime legislation and troops were used to curtail industrial action and crush strikes. The practice of using troops to do the work of men on strike was adopted on a number of occasions between 1945 and 51. In October 1946, the London dockers' strike, triggered by a substantial wage reduction, led to the government introduction of troops to unload ships. They were again used in the London electricity power stations dispute, as well as the Bristol dock strike. Troops were also used in the gas maintenance workers' strike of September 1949, where the Labour government used wartime legislation to take legal action against 10 strikers, who were initially sentenced to 1 month's imprisonment, but later released on a fine. The Labour government was equally quick to display its capitalist credentials in the area of social reform, where it had the clear intention of making capitalism run more smoothly in the interest of the owners. Central to the Labour government's post-war social reforms was the Beveridge Report and the introduction of the National Health Service. In capitalism, reforms come about not normally as a result of worker agitation, but are quite often proposed by avowedly capitalist parties or organisations that recognise the need for an adjustment in the workings of the system. As capitalism changes, so the organisation of working people must also change. It had long been recognised that insecurity caused unrest and affected worker productivity. After the First World War, unemployment and general disillusionment amongst workers who had been promised homes fit for heroes had combined to lower profits. It was widely anticipated that left unchecked, similar unrest would follow the Second World War and would once again lower profits. To address this issue, the Wartime Coalition set up the Interdepartmental Committee to investigate social insurance, commonly seen as the key to overcoming worker unrest. William Beveridge, a Liberal and Master of University College London, chaired the committee. The reforms proposed by Beveridge were not motivated by some philanthropic yearning to eradicate poverty. They were driven by the need to regulate class struggle and to eliminate any obstacle that might impede the profitable working of post-war capitalism. Reforms that were designed to rationalise and reduce the cost of poor relief and improve the efficiency of working men and women. His findings were published in the Report on Social Insurance and Allied Services in 1942, which was accepted in principle by the War Coalition, making it certain that most of Beveridge's recommendations would have been implemented regardless of which political party of capitalism actually won the election. A promise to implement the Beveridge reforms was a bribe that would head off the expected unrest after the war, and its timing was intended to boost wartime morale and productivity by promises of a better world. In the words of the report, Each individual is more likely to concentrate upon the war effort if he feels that his government will be ready in time with plans for that better world. Excuse me. Acceptance of reforms was regarded as imperative, for as Quentin Hogg MP, the future Lord Hailsham, put it in February 1942, if you don't give people social reform, they are going to give you social revolution. Many of the proposals were already in existence, and Beveridge's main objective was to make them universal and put them in a single unified scheme, which was to be called social security. But as the Socialist Party pointed out at the time, the term social security was a complete misnomer, because it was neither social, because it was only the working class that suffered the poverty described in the report, and nor did it provide security, since the only security it offered workers was the security from starvation. The Beveridge report identified 5 great evils: want, disease, ignorance, squalor and idleness, which would be overcome by child allowances, insurance schemes, a national health service, more houses, a policy of full employment and secondary education for all. Poor relief had not substantially changed from the time of Elizabeth I, when the enclosure of common land, usually in favour of more profitable sheep, resulted in legions of transient poor and the enactment of the Poor Laws, with poor relief administered by the parish. By the Second World War, poor relief had become a complex array of overlapping schemes, and the financial burden on the parish was crippling. The wartime coalition heeded calls that central government must take an active part in poor relief to spread the burden over the whole of the earning class. The drive for this simplification and efficiency began with the 1945 Family Allowances Act. It was said the Act, which was actually introduced by the wartime coalition but claimed by the Labour government, would eradicate the major part of poverty, because according to Beveridge, the greatest single cause of poverty in this country is young children. He proposed the payment of allowances outside of wages that would cover the cost of raising children and head off a general rise in wage levels. But his argument went further than one devised simply to avoid a general wage increase. Beveridge identified that the real issue was not that workers' wages were insufficient to meet the cost of raising a family, but instead those workers who had no family to support actually received too much in wages. Wages, the price of labour power as a commodity, are meant to cover the worker's means of subsistence, together with that of the worker's family, to cover the cost of raising future generations of wage slaves. This being the case, workers who had no children but received the same wages as those who did actually received more in wages than was necessary. If then the cost of raising a family could be covered outside of wages, it would not simply prevent a general wage increase, but would actually allow the general wages level to fall to cover the subsistence of the worker, his partner and the first child only. Family allowances were instrumental in actually reducing the national wages bill, an objective achieved over a period of time by introducing these allowances at a time of rising prices. In 1946, the Labour government passed the National Insurance Act, which extended the Liberals' 1911 Act that had introduced contributory health insurance and contributory unemployment insurance schemes. Capitalism has an interest in the maintenance of working people in the same way as it has an interest in well-maintained machinery, since efficient and healthy workers lower production costs and produce greater profits. As Beveridge put it, it is in the interest of employers that the employees should have security, should be properly maintained during the inevitable intervals of unemployment or of sickness, and should have the contentment which makes them efficient producers. The Act extended provision of benefits to all adults. It was both contributory and compulsory, and provided benefit for sickness and unemployment, together with old age pension, maternity allowances and death grants to help with funeral expenses. Under the Act, sickness benefit would last 13 weeks, but would not apply to the worker's partner or children and was means tested. Unemployment insurance, which had previously applied to only certain specialised industry trades, such as construction and shipbuilding, where the demand for labour fluctuated, was extended to cover all adults, and after a qualifying employment period, benefit would be paid for up to 15 weeks in a 12-month period. But receipt of benefits also carried a threat of compulsion and could be withdrawn if the worker refused to accept work or training. The 1948 National Assistance Act plugged the loopholes in the National Insurance Act. The Act also introduced national assistance boards that acknowledged poverty as a permanent feature of capitalism, where workers could apply for further means-tested assistance. Other services were to be provided by local authorities. The same principle of worker efficiency underscored the introduction of the National Health Service, which provided free medical care to everyone who needed it. At the beginning of the 20th century, Lloyd George had become involved in the issue of worker health, when it became clear that the appalling physical condition of army volunteers made it virtually impossible to raise an army to defend the overseas interests of British capitalism. The Committee of Physical Deterioration, set up in 1904, urged that workers' children, the future soldiers and wage slaves, should be properly fed and cared for, and proposed school meals and medical inspections. It argued that a healthy workforce would be more efficient and therefore more profitable for the owners. The February 1944 White Paper for a National Health Service continued this theme. It acknowledged that the working class in Britain had been through a depression followed by a war and rationing, and worker health was at an unacceptably low level. It recognised that a healthy workforce was essential to capitalism and far too important to be left to chance or dependent on the worker's own ability to pay for necessary medical care. Its timing, like the Beveridge recommendations, was intended to boost worker wartime morale. It asserted that a centralised NHS would cope with the sick quickly and efficiently, thereby enabling working people to return to work without delay. It also accepted that worker efficiency was often influenced by sickness of the worker's partner or children, and therefore proposed that free health treatment should be universal. The introduction of the NHS on the 5th of July 1948 is often seen as the most spectacular of Labour's social reforms, and a monument to Aneurin Bevan, its chief architect. But not everyone was in favour. There were divisions within the Labour Party itself, and the BMA initially opposed its introduction. Doctors maintained that an NHS would erode their independence, reduce them to civil servants, and stifle initiative. They also objected to payment of wages, refusing to acknowledge their status as members of the working class, an obstacle overcome when Bevan introduced fee payments based on the number of panel patients instead of a salary. In its first year of operation, the NHS cost over £400 million. This sum greatly exceeded expectation that had grossly underestimated the cost of raising the level of workers' health. Prescriptions that had been running at £7 million a month under the old scheme doubled by September 1948 and reached £19 million a month by 1951. The NHS had to be paid for, and the money raised from taxation and national insurance contributions came from the capitalist class. This led the Labour Party to reverse its commitment to a free health service when, in 1951, it began charging adults half cost for false teeth and spectacles. One of the Labour government's most pressing problems was housing. An acute housing shortage already existed in 1939 and was exacerbated by the 700,000 houses that had been destroyed during the war. Housing came under the control of Bevin's Ministry of Health, which launched a housing drive. Most of the new constructions were subsidised council houses, which acted to reduce pressure on wages, but some were prefabs, constructions that Bevan privately described as rabbit hutches, but nevertheless good enough for working people. Despite the obvious need, however, the government made sure that factory building was given priority over hospitals, schools and houses, and when Bevan left office there was still a housing shortage of some 750,000 dwellings. In education, the process of providing schooling for the sons and daughters of wage slaves to prepare them for a life of wage slavery, the Labour government did no more than carry out the 1944 Butler Education Act that introduced free secondary education to all and raised the school leaving age to 15. A new Ministry of Education was set up to direct local authorities, which were expected to provide secondary schools. The Act introduced the 11+ examination that divided school children into grammar or secondary modern schools, but failed to provide adequate funding for sufficient grammar school places and simply represented a selection process of the required number of children to fill the places available. It was criticised as divisive, as secondary schools quickly became regarded as the place for failures that train the skill for future manual workers. The education budget was cut at the time of the Korean War, and the Labour government failed to meet its school building targets. In the conduct of foreign policy, the post-war Labour government did what it could to preserve the interests of British capitalism abroad, and in 1946 troops were active in Germany, Greece, Iran, India, Egypt, Palestine, Malaya and Singapore. Ernest Bevin, Labour's Foreign Secretary, made his commitment to British capitalism in the House of Commons when he said, "I am not prepared to sacrifice the British Empire, because I know that if the British Empire fell, it would mean the standard of living of our constituents would fall considerably," by which of course he meant that British capitalism would suffer from the loss of colonial profits. But the influence of British capitalism was in decline, and a cash-strapped government was obliged to grant independence to India in 1947, an event that intensified rivalry between Muslim and Hindus and led directly to partition. It also withdrew from the Palestine-Arab-Israeli conflict in May 1948, but retained a commitment in the Middle East to protect the Suez and British capitalism's oil interest, particularly the controlling interest in the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Protecting British capitalism's control of the Middle East oil was a key component of Labour's foreign policy, but awkwardly in direct contradiction to its avowedly anti-imperialist rhetoric. The Labour government also used troops in Greece to suppress the wartime anti-fascist resistance that threatened a return to the status quo, on the pretence that Russia might take over Greece to force itself on Middle Eastern oil, by now the preserve of British and American capitalism. Excuse me. This period of history is also eventful for a number of other reasons. During this period, capitalist superpower rivalry between Russia and America over future spheres of influence, a confrontation that became known as the Cold War, dominated the global agenda, boiling over to the Berlin crisis and the Korean War. Also during this period, the US government made funds available under the Marshall Plan to guarantee the US export market and ensure that business-friendly governments were reinstalled in Europe and elsewhere. In 1949, NATO was established to strengthen America's European allies and to harden public opinion against Russian state capitalism. And it is also in this period that the Labour government ordered the construction of the atomic bomb, a topic that will be dealt with by Richard in his session this afternoon. By the general election of February 1950, the hope for a better world had all but evaporated, and Labour's majority was reduced to 5. It struggled on until October 1951, when the Conservatives were returned to power with a slim majority of 17. So what are we to make of the post-war Labour government? The Labour government was a product of capitalism. Government necessarily means securing the submission of the working class, and running capitalism can only mean running it in the interest of the owning class. The Labour policy of a planned economy and nationalisation left capitalism unaltered, where industries still had to pay their way. It left the working class in exactly the same position, wage and salary earners and producers of surplus value for the former owners. Labour's social reforms amounted to little more than measures to rationalise poor relief, cut administration costs and improve worker efficiency. Trade union support for the Labour government greatly reduced its effectiveness and split class solidarity. Returning then to the title of our day's call, Labour Government 1945-51, Hope and Deception. Did the Labour government represent hope? Here the answer, of course, is yes, at least in the beginning. In 1945, the Labour Party had swept into government on the wave of hope and optimism of a war-weary working class who genuinely believed that a Labour government would help make the world a better place. They, like the working class at every successive election, believed the lies of a political party and its leaders and put their misplaced trust in a Labour government that promised a better world. Excuse me. Was it then a deception? Here the answer is both no and yes. No, it wasn't a deception, inasmuch as the Labour Party had sought and won a mandate from the electorate to lead British capitalism out of difficult times, and held no mandate to do anything else, despite the widely held conviction that it would champion the interests of working people. Put brutally, the working class got exactly what it voted for. But at the same time, it can be argued, yes, it was a deception for 2 reasons. Firstly, despite misunderstanding the nature of capitalism, working people were led to believe that a Labour government, boasting its trade union roots, would be more sympathetic to their plight. This misplaced trust allowed the Labour government to pursue policies more draconian than a Conservative government would have dared, using wartime legislation and troops to crush worker strikes, while conspiring with trade union leaders to secure wage restraint at a time of rising prices. There can be no doubt that a Labour government did capitalism great service during this period. Secondly, the Labour government falsely claimed to be something it wasn't, namely a political party with the aim of establishing socialism. The Labour Party's deceitful claims spread confusion and impeded working class understanding. Then, as now, working people had difficulty in comprehending that capitalism is an economic system based on their own exploitation, a fact that was blurred and distorted by the Labour government. To many, the Labour Party and its capitalist policies became synonymous with socialism, its meaning adulterated to mean no more than a different method of running the capitalist system. This deception turned many away from considering the socialist alternative and has since handicapped the socialist movement, struggling to spread the socialist message.